This conference will now be recorded.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this fourth seminar of the Ideal for OMOP program. You're all very welcome here today, where the main topic of conversation we'll be turning our attention to patients and the vital role that they can play in research in general, and specifically in real-world research. Our speakers today, I think you know me by now, you probably know Will as well, but we're particularly delighted to have with us Rachel Giles. Rachel is a member of our Leadership Advisory Board. She's an associate professor. She's president of VHL Europe, about which you'll be hearing more later on, but a hugely experienced and distinguished patient advocate with a lot of deep experience about how patients can get best involved in care and research as well. The way we're going to run today is we're going to start with just the usual, actually, recap from me, just reminding us where we are in the program, where we're heading, what the timescales are. We're then going to switch to Will, who's going to have a short sort of discussion on the subject of team formation, because that milestone is starting to come in on us, and we want to start to help you coalesce into groups of interest around particular tumour types and research topics. But the majority of the time will be what's going to be a fantastic presentation from Rachel. So that first item then, just a little recap of where we are. Well, this is seminar 4 out of the 6 that we have scheduled. The last one was 2 weeks ago. Those of you who were there, it was a deep dive into some of the more technical tools that are available for running studies in OMOP. We've also had a seminar on the more epidemiological aspects around study design, an introductory seminar. If you weren't able to see them at the time, they are available for you to review on the program SharePoint. And if you haven't had access to that, we're working through it, but please do let us know. So yes, today, as I said at the beginning, really we will be spending most of the time considering the important role that patients can play in research. But again, I just wanted to remind you where we are. Still very much in that first phase, the basic training, but we're coming towards the end of the seminar series. We'll be more than halfway through by the end of today, and those seminars will conclude next month. And then the idea then is that we'll be switching into the mode of team formation and starting to help you coalesce, as I say, around particular research topics. That's going to take us through probably till September time. And in September, that's when the process of actually taking your study concepts, getting feedback on them and applying for funding will start. And then as we move into next year, the actual study conduct will be taking place. So we're still at a relatively early stage, but things are moving on. And I really would start to encourage you to start thinking now really about where your particular interests might lie when it comes to doing your own studies and running your own studies in OMOP. I said this last time, but I think it bears repeating, is we're not expecting you to do this without any support or help from us. And there's many different aspects to this. So obviously there's the seminars, which we've got today. There's the SharePoint. As I say, if you're struggling to access that, please let me and Will know. We're going to introduce you to some colleagues in seminar 6, people who've been through a similar process before, some of the DIGICORE experts as well. The Leadership Advisory Board, and as I said, thrilled to have a member of the lab speaking to us today, but actually also each other and the way in which you interact and learn together and learn from each other is going to be absolutely critical to your experience of the program and your success in running the studies. So with that in mind, actually no, let me quickly start just to note, I mentioned the Leadership Advisory Board. Hopefully this is all familiar to you, but you remember there's some very distinguished people from across the European cancer research community, and also me and Will, but some very distinguished people who've kindly given of their time and energy to support this, and both in terms of the kind of talk component today, but you'll also be getting to know these guys as you start to bring forward your study concepts and seek their input and guidance. but learning from each other, I think, is going to be a key part of this. And I'm going to hand over to Will briefly now to talk a little bit about how we might start to get you together into teams.
Thanks very much, James. So as James has said, IDEAL4OMOP is not only personal learning, but it is about building project collaboration, and we're getting towards that point. Now, this is a list of not of formed groups by any means, but this is information we have from your enrollment forms as to what particular indications you have expertise in or are interested in. Many of you have got multiple interests, and the keen-eyed amongst you will see that some names repeat in each in different indications here. But many of you also have much more general interests, and particularly skills in biostatistics, database project management, not so focused on one indication. These indications here, and don't get too caught up on the names. Some of these actually haven't made it to any webinars, and we always have some kind of fall off on a course. These are by no means final, as I said. But these indications, these 5 indications, urological cancer, breast cancer, colorectal, lung, and gynecological cancer, feel to us like the most solid chance of building some projects. And the reason is because we have, as you can see, multiple countries with a specific interest. We have a mix of biostatistics and clinical expertise and interest in these indications. But we also have a number of sites with an existing OMOP instance. This is, of course, trying to build OMOP studies. And as we've said before, it wasn't a prerequisite for joining the course. And many of you I know are in progress to build an OMOP instance. But for the moment, we would like to really build. This is DIGICORE's aim, is to build some OMOP studies. So these are the 5 indications where at the moment we have the best chance of doing that. What I'd really like to hear from you, particularly those who didn't necessarily express a preference or have multiple interests, is any thoughts you have in terms of what study out of these 5 or others that you would like to begin to build some research questions around. You can let me know in the chat. Today you can email. We will be, as time goes on, beginning to form teams a little bit more formally through the SharePoint. But yeah, any early thoughts from those of you that particularly who didn't necessarily express a preference when you enrolled in the study, please do let us know, and we can add a little bit more solidity to these studies. The other thing just to mention about building teams is that if you don't have an OMOP instance, we need to kind of thrash this out a little bit together on the course as to how we're going to build these studies. But there will be alternatives as well. There'll be a number of other ways that for those of you that are really keen to start building collaboration can do that. So more on that as we go through, and particularly in that webinar 6, but before then as well in preparation. Yep, please do put on the chat on this call. That's probably the quickest way to express a preference of a particular study. It may be that as we hear from others, and obviously it looks like there's 24 of us on the call today. There's a lot that aren't on live. So when we hear from others also on email, there may be other indications that we can begin to build projects around. But we'd like you to start thinking about it. We'd like you to start thinking about some research questions, maybe from the input so far on the course, and learning a bit more about OMOP and what the potential is. And I'm sure after today's talk, you may also, that might spur some questions, some research question ideas from you. So more on this. This is just a start, but as James said, to flag that from now we're going to begin to try and build these study collaborations. to deliver some studies. Any immediate questions on that? Final thing to say about the list names on this list, as I said, these are not fixed. These are just preferences that have been expressed. There's opportunity to swap around if you do see your name on this list, but you want to go somewhere else. That's absolutely fine. Great, thanks for putting that in the chat. We will report back and yeah, continue to solidify that process until we have some really solid collaboration teams together to start building your protocols. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Will. If I can just sort of stress the or the rationale, if you like, behind this idea of doing collaborative studies. Number one, when we think about the mission of DIGICORE, when we think about the I3 program, I think we can see how the idea of international real-world studies is increasingly of interest to funding bodies. So the I3 program, obviously, is in and of itself an international program. So we want, for the future of research and to help you become part of teams that are able to apply for and receive substantial funding, we want to build that collaborative view across organizations and across countries. So I think there's that lens. But I think what I'd also say is that the participants who went through the, if you like, the precursor program to this that was called IDEAL4OMOP, you may have heard us talk about it a little bit. The experience of the people who went through that, I think, is certainly true to say that the kind of relationships that they formed, the new professional collaborations, the research that they were able to do, the networks that they were able to build was an absolutely critical and very, very worthwhile part of the program for them and their own professional development. So the collaborations are going to be critical because it will help you secure funding, but also I think it'll be one of the more fulfilling one of the ways in which you can further your own professional development. So thank you already. It's great to see people responding in the chat, and Will and I will be getting in touch with you as these things crystallize and will help that process of formation. So thank you for that. I'm now very pleased to say that with the sort of formalities over, we can move on to Rachel. If you missed the introduction at the beginning, hugely happy to have Rachel, one of our Leadership Advisory Board members, hugely experienced as a patient advocate and really knows why and how to make this work. So over to you, Rachel.
I'm feeling a little bit of pressure here, but it's fantastic to be here. So thank you for inviting me to speak. I don't know much about OMOP, so I'm going to start there, but I do know a lot about patient advocacy and how to incorporate that into research, which is, I suppose, the reason why I was asked to join here today. So I have a bit of an outline here, and I'll be returning to the slide throughout the talk, so you'll get a big thing. But I wanted to start off with the big picture. So if you could just advance the slide, please, James. So I'm going to start with the slide that, like, if we could give Oscars to figures in papers, this would be my all-time favorite figure. This is a paper that came out in JAMA in 2017. It's a randomized controlled trial. It's randomized by site, not by patients. It's an all-comer, whoever's getting any kind of standard cancer treatment, get in, and I think 50 centers, and they randomized the centers that 25 received iPads for patient-reported symptom monitoring, and the other half did not. And they did a follow-up. The primary outcome in this particular case was overall survival. It was incredibly positive, but also progression-free survival, recurrence-free survival. All of the various endpoints that were selected were positive in this case. It's a fantastic paper, and I strongly recommend you read it because it supports the idea that just activating and engaging your patient cohort, at least in the cancer setting, improves outcomes, hard clinical outcomes like overall survival. And we've known for decades that there's been positive reports going on also through randomized controlled trials, solid evidence looking at well-being, psychological support, anxiety, all those things. We know that there's been a lot of softer outcomes that have been measured and have shown benefit for patients who are receiving an engagement training of any kind. So this is just one of those papers that shows that if this was a drug, this would be immediately approved. But this is basically free. It's not a drug. It does not require millions of dollars to develop, and it's something that can be applied. So one of the questions that I'd like to ask you today is, can we apply this sort of trial-based evidence, looking forward into real-world evidence? And I'm really interested in hearing your comments and questions throughout. Next. So this is just a quick reminder for those of you who are familiar with this story by Ethan Bash. He's actually repeated and expanded this trial because there was so much buzz around it that they said that they really wanted to know more about it. So they extended it and expanded it. The secondary endpoints have been reported about 2 years ago, and they were all positive. They're still waiting for the final overall survival data to mature. But I just checked the ASCO just before this talk. I checked the ASCO meeting, and it's not being presented there. So I think it's going to be presented at ESMO, because I spoke with Ethan Bash not too long ago, and he promised it was coming out this year. So I think at ESMO this year, we'll probably be seeing the overall survival from the second trial. But I think given the secondary outcomes, I'm pretty sure we're going to see a positive trial again. Next. So this is just a slide to remind people that we all have different incentives for cancer research. And from the academic perspective on the right column, there's career incentives, there's grant funding, there's academic recognition. Of course, there's the doing the best you can for the patients that you work with. All of those things are important. From the left, in the left column, you have the industry incentives. You've got markets, you've got proprietary drugs, you've got regulatory issues and so forth. But when it comes down to the patients and we are the primary stakeholders, there's really one incentive with a little hashtag to it. It's survival, but also survival with a good quality of life. And quality of life is something that we'll be coming back to over and over again. It's a very important concept, and it should be considered as a potential primary outcome for most trials. You can recycle alpha for some of these things. Next. So I want to move on to a little bit of my story because it'll put things in perspective. So personally, I grew up in California. You can hear my American accent. I've lived in the Netherlands for 34 years, so more than half my life. But when I was a kid growing up in California, I was in a family, and that's a picture of me holding an American flag there in the upper right corner. Our family was studied a lot, and that's because we are affected by neurofibromatosis type 1. And we were part of the paper, the original science paper that came out, that finding the gene and describing the function of the protein. But growing up in a family with several affected members and actually having deaths in the family, having a lot of discussions about reproduction and whether someone should, choose to have children or not, and all of the family dynamics that go with that, and not always the best dynamics, to be honest. You really understand the unmet needs of patients in all perspectives because you see them throughout the entire cycle. And when I grew up, next slide, and I was a girl doctor, this is my graduation picture, and here I decided, I think that's a little funny, isn't it? Maybe it's just me, there you go. And these are my lab members, actually. I did my thesis on breast cancer 1, BRCA1, in Mary Claire King's lab, and this is Jeff Hall next to me. I worked on his team to find the breast cancer 1 gene. I was really drawn to understanding hereditary cancer syndromes and how this works in families, and not just the clinical aspects, but also the whole picture, because my family is so severely affected by it. So next. It's a big slide, so it takes a second to load. There you go. So this is my career, actually, is kind of my academic career in a single slide. I look at kidney tubules. I'm really interested in what goes wrong in the very early stages of renal cell carcinoma. And here you see these little hairs sticking into the tubes of the kidney tubule. Those are called cilia. And we know that cilia are super important for regulating cell regulation in the kidney. And when they go away, and there's over 50 genes that can be mutated and affect cilia growth, we know that the result is a very benign, very simple cyst that happens in the kidney. And there's probably someone on this call with a kidney cyst. It's so common, and it almost never leads to anything wrong. However, there's one exception to this rule, and that is mutations in a single gene called VHL, von Hippel-Lindau it's short for, can actually drive that simple cyst into a complex and quite metastatic renal cell carcinoma. And those of you in the urological team, I'm here for you. So it's a big deal, and people that are born with a mutation in the VHL gene will develop not just kidney cancer, lots of other tumors as well, both benign and malignant, and it's a pretty hard burden. And when I decided to start my own lab and start studying the process of cancer, I chose VHL as my model because it's a fairly simple system to recreate in the lab, and in this case, I also did it with zebrafish as well. And you have a single gene causing a single major deadly disease. That's a pretty simple system to work with, and that's where I put a lot of my career into. So next. So this is a really basic and really kind of crappy, excuse me, PowerPoint picture here showing the triangle of communication cooperation between physicians and medical researchers in general up at the top, patients and patient organizations there at the right, and on the left we have the healthcare industry, the pharmaceutical companies, but also devices, any of the supportive care that is commercially available. Next. So the obvious thing when you want to think about how to get patients involved in research, the most obvious and probably something that most of you have already tried is people from the academic world, from either the physicians or the researchers, will reach out to the patient groups. And this is a very important step. So if you could go to the next slide. And that's the first thing I did too. And I became kind of, I don't know, what's the word, infamous for being the VHL geek. I attended lots of conferences and set up tables and talked to patients about my research. And it was really fun. I learned so much doing this about what patients could and couldn't understand, what they lived with, and how they were, what they would like me to do as a researcher to do this. It was just tremendous fun. This was at the Dana-Farber Center and Cancer Center at Harvard, but I did this probably a dozen times. And it was always incredibly fun and well received. And I suggest that I brought my graduate students and we just made a kind of a small science fair out of it. And we were the only people there. There was no other researchers there. This was just at a patient meeting. So next. So that kind of brought me into the advocacy world. And so I reached out to my patient group, which are the VHL patients in the Netherlands, because I'm based in Amsterdam. And I became the chair since 2009, so I'm still the chair. It's one of those things that once you're on the board, they never will let you get off, but it is very rewarding. So we have about 400 patients in the Netherlands. It's a rare disease. It affects about 1 in 36,000 people. And we do the standard things. We provide patient information. We manage a small group of volunteers. We have a couple meetings a year. We run some magazines. We support medical research. We run a multidisciplinary team through teams every month, and we also arrange funding through cancer societies and whatnot. So it's a small scale amount of work. It takes me probably a week of my time a year total. It's just not a big investment, and it's incredibly rewarding. Next. So that makes a lot of sense. You reach out to your local cohort, the people that you work with that you're trying to research, and you get to know them and you figure out their needs. But at a certain point, that patient organization starts investing in itself, starts maturing, accruing governance. It probably wants to connect and collaborate with other patient groups that have either similar symptoms or similar drugs. And those are important things to do. So if you could do next. But you'll find yourself specializing in something. So here are two examples of things that we do. Because VHL is such a hard disease to live with, and these people will develop tumors all over their bodies throughout their life, and it's starting from the age of 1, we've been focusing on youth, and we bring together all the youth. In fact, last weekend in Munich, we had a youth group for VHL patients in Europe. It's entirely funded. The young people don't have to pay anything. The idea is to really teach them about the most critical time of their life, which is being a young adult living with a chronic disease, and how are you going to date, get employed, study, buy a house. Insurance is incredibly hard for people with hereditary tumor syndrome, things like that. So we go through all these very social and classic problems, but mostly it's a team building exercise. And these people will stay in touch all their lives, and they celebrate weddings together and graduations and promotions at work and so forth. It's a beautiful thing. The other thing we do is at a higher level here on the right, you'll see much older individuals, and we are VHL Europa. So these are all the VHL groups. There's 13 groups in Europe that run VHL organizations. Some of them represent more than one country, like Scandinavia is lumped all together. Austria, Hungary, and Switzerland are all together, and things like that. But in theory, we cover about 12,000 patients in all of Europe, and we are collectively, work with agents, European agents like the EMA for drug approval. We work together to generate data across Europe and to collect patient experience data to report for health technology assessment purposes. So next. So I'm going to delve a little bit into patient organizations and what they are. And I'll just start with what most people think patient organizations are, and they're correct. It's just not quite the full picture. So the common perception is that it is a peer-to-peer support system. Next. But just to remind you, well, the slide is loading, it's actually much more than that. Peer-to-peer support is actually almost always the start of patient groups. Not always, some of them are focused purely on policy or research, but most of them start with patient support. And that is important. People do this at the local level, national level. Typically, it's very effective at that level. The European level, it's in rare diseases like VHL, it's almost essential that we work at a European level or regional level in this case, because there just simply aren't that many patients. So it varies. And also at the global level, if you really want to, work with the WHO, those are usually larger diseases that have a larger impact, then you can do that. But also really important in health policy, super important. I've never been to Brussels so much in my life since I've become a patient advocate. I'm there a lot because they're really interested in hearing about the patient perspectives on their policy decisions and how the impact is on patient care. And so we generate data based on their questions and then feed it back to them. And that's something that's an ongoing thing. I think as a researcher, you have far less impact at health policy than you do as a patient advocate. And there's a lot of examples I can give if you're interested, but I won't go into that too much. But again, that's at the European level, the national level, and at the global level. With research, obviously, having patients involved in research really contributes to the partnership. It completely works beautifully. And you can also combine this with industry as well and make a multi-stakeholder approach to research, which can often deliver the biggest impact possible. But the question really is how do you go about doing that? So if you could take me to the next slide, please. So there's something that we've coined about called evidence-based advocacy. So evidence-based advocacy, this is the cartoon we use for the patients. It's about data, not about opinions. Patients will often have their own stories and it'll be emotionally charged. It's very difficult to communicate, incredibly powerful, but it's not always the data that needs to be discussed. And so oftentimes it's good to teach the patient advocates what evidence-based advocacy is and how they can really twist their story into something incredibly impactful and really figure out how to target the advocacy in the right way. So next. And it's really the same as evidence-based medicine, only in the case of evidence-based advocacy, we're taking stories, we're taking experiences, and trying to document it in the best way possible. We mix it with the best research evidence and clinical expertise, and then you've got a beautiful sweet spot. If you could do the next animation on this. Thanks. On the left side, what you'll see is the highest level of evidence. Together, evidence-based advocacy can really work together with evidence-based medicine in forming guidelines in all of the important sort of impact assessments that are essential, health technology assessments as well. Incredibly important stuff, but it's a whole science. Most patients that are affected by cancer aren't scientists. There are a few. I've had cancer 3 times myself before the age of 50. So you have to find and shape the people with the talents that they have and really teach them how to. And there's an entire training system here in Europe that does not exist in the United States. We are very lucky to have this in Europe, where there is subsidized training, really good training for patient advocates to learn about how to read a paper, how to write a paper, how to make a database, and how to analyze, basic statistics and so forth, and work with researchers and guideline panels. Next. So here I am back at this terrible triangle, and we've got patient organizations that have started to mature and collaborate with other patient groups. And at a certain point, however, you come up across a barrier, and that barrier is, next slide, really simply speaking, it's money. You cannot work with volunteers too much. I mean, at a certain point, you need to pay people to run the organizations. And if you need money, where do you have to go get money? Do you go to your academics? You can't. Do you go to healthcare industry? Well, healthcare industry cannot go to you as a patient. It's illegal. It's not allowed. They are not allowed to approach you at all. So that's not an option. But they do have the money. However, next, the patient organizations can talk to the healthcare industry. And so we invite healthcare industry to talk with us about what the needs are and what we might want to do. Then they may propose, oh, maybe you could apply for some educational grant money, or depending on the situation. But we have certain rules involved in this as well. Next slide. And the rules get pretty complicated, and it requires a governance structure of some flavor. And so typically at this point, what most patient groups that are decided to collaborate together on the right is they form a third party, and that third party is typically a nonprofit company. And that not-for-profit company, in the case that I worked with VHL patients and then with kidney cancer in general, is called the International Kidney Cancer Coalition. We're a global coalition of 52 groups, and we formed basically a foundation here in the Netherlands. And we run the money that we apply for grants through both the European Union. We're on 7 European grants, and as well as healthcare industry, pharmaceutical. And you get a very nice way of figuring out the projects that will benefit all 52 of these groups, or even individual, maybe some regional groups, European groups or African groups or Asian groups may have special requests. And we work with them to actually, that's how you get the work done in advocacy. We work with the WHO as well to provide palliative care for kidney cancer patients in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's really a broad package here, but when you have that third party, you require a staff, a function, a lawyer, tax people, and so forth, and it's quite a different story altogether. Next. So to do this, you really do need to make rules. You need to form a code of conduct that is true to your mission and vision. What we do, and we recommend, because we are one of the templates that many of the other groups work with, and we request equal amounts of money from each company so that no company has a more dominant approach. So we have 12 companies that all donate the same amount every year. On top of that, we have projects, like basically a drop-down menu of projects that they can choose to contribute to specially, but no project will happen unless it has at least 3 companies sign up to it. So we provide a bunch of projects, and then if they have 3 companies, then we can say, okay, the project will go on. We work with global budgets so that we do not compete with our national chapters. So if we have a Dutch group, I have a Dutch group, and we want, IKCC wants to do a big project, a global project. We go to the global office in New York or in New Jersey. We request the money there. And that way, we do never compete with our individual organizations who are requesting national funding for their own projects. And we always ask that the funding is unrestricted and independent. They have no say. It's a one-time stop. They donate to the project, and the only thing we deliver back to them are the reports about what we did with it. They have no say in how things happen. So next. So what is the evidence that patient advocacy is actually beneficial? And this is a tricky one. It's really very complex, but there isn't a lot of research into this. So what we thought as patient advocates, and there's a large and very well-developed para-academic group here in Europe, really fantastic people, is that if the long-term potential, if we can demonstrate that improved outcomes with cancer patient activation, we could probably get it prescribed, basically, get patient engagement and involvement with patient organizations in research, we can get them funded by, for example, payers, by insurance companies to support patient education, support advocacy, because in the end, it's increasing overall survival. We have that data. We want to decrease healthcare utilization, obviously reducing hospital stays and visits to the ER, decrease complaints. I mean, medical professionals are always interested in that as well. Improve quality of care with reduced variation. And we want to design innovative clinical trials. And of course, from the patient perspective, and I'm going to spell this out to you a little bit, we'd like to support the use of PROs, PROMs, and PREMs. For those of you who don't know what those are basically questionnaires that are included in clinical trials. It's patient-reported outcomes, or PROs. PROMs are patient-reported outcome measures, which are usually quantitative, whereas PROs can be qualitative. And there's also patient-reported experience measures, PREMs. And those are very useful, for example, in measuring hospitals and hospital performances, very broad swath stuff. So really important, I know that even in Canada, they use PREMs nationally to rank the hospitals, which I think is fantastic, really interesting and innovative use. Next. So we undertook, and this is just an example of one of the many projects, we decided we wanted to see what is the literature there that actually shows something being useful for patient engagement in outcomes. And so we did a systematic review. I can skip next slide. I already showed this slide, so we can go skip through it. Next. Yep, next. But there were others, really interesting trials. This is breast cancer patients where they used 26 psychological 1-hour sessions. So over a year, every 2 weeks for 1 year, these patients received psychological interventions and 11 years follow-up. They see this overall survival. If you look at this amazing graph on the right, incredible. The intervention arm lived much longer and better. Next. Also here, this is acute myeloid leukemia. This is again, it's an integrated care. It involved patient education in combination with psychology and counseling by telephone. This was simply a telephone intervention, and already you see on the right side, you see the overall survival is phenomenally better. Next. So we know there's actually a lot of other studies that show that patient engagement interventions definitely lead to improved emotional well-being, coping strategies, physical well-being and less fatigue, general disease-related quality of life, self-care, and compliance. But now the data that we've got in this paper is under review, so I'm sorry I don't have I can't put a citation there yet. But the survival rates have improved in 50% of the studies. And that means that patient engagement actually prolongs life. And this is one of the main reasons why you should be driven to include your patients in your research. Next. So this is not a new idea. This is Forbes magazine. It's a bit cheesy, but it's, patient engagement is the blockbuster drug of the century. But some of the questions is really, should we be prescribing patient engagement just as we would prescribe any of those other drugs that come out of these primary endpoint randomized clinical trials? Next. So I'm just going to talk briefly about a couple examples of how patient participation might be important for the OMOP scenarios that you guys are struggling with and working with and trying to figure out how to incorporate the patient voice perhaps and in your projects. So these are just a couple of ideas, and really I have more questions than you do, so happy to talk about it, but don't really have all the answers here. But certainly keep in mind that this will enhance the data relevance. And for example, just patient-reported outcomes, really important. It provides a more comprehensive view of patient health. And here is a citation I found where they recommend that, and they go through these predictive models, and they show really critical insights about how cancer causes progression. Cancer causes and progression. Next. There's also improved data quality and completeness. This is borrowing from another field altogether, not cancer-related, pulmonary hypertension. Huge databases really showed that capturing clinical events in OMOP and OMOP systems really supported the comprehensive data mapping and analysis. Next. It improves the external validity and generalizability. I don't even know how to say that. So this makes sure that the data actually is reflecting real-world conditions by improving the generalizability and of the research findings that you may have. It has been validated through various case studies, but there's still a lot of data lacking out there. So hoping that you guys can help, kick into that. And patient-reported data really does give critical insights into real-world treatment effects and outcomes, as well as just patients' experiences. So I strongly suggest you take a look at this particular paper. Next. And I think importantly, there's regulatory and policy implications. The impact of whatever work you do generate in your career will ultimately, you want to see if you can affect policy and change whatever regulatory guidelines, and it's important to get sure that's clear. There's a good paper here talking about how OMOP can facilitate data-driven studies on cancer prediction. I also recommend you read this paper. It's an excellent paper. Next. I think the last example I have here is it improves patient outcomes and engagement. So this is just looking at the observational health data sciences and informatics community, and they have put out a statement supporting the inclusion of patient-reported outcomes to support more patient-centered research, and this is just a reference to that particular GitHub. Next. So I just have one kind of small example, and this is specific for kidney cancer, so those of you in neurological cancers may be familiar with this. We have a problem in kidney cancer where you have a tumor and then you get surgery, and then depending on, they do a prognostic model to see if you're high risk, low risk, or medium risk, and intermediate risk, and then based on that, if you're high or intermediate risk, you can be offered adjuvant therapy. And the question has always been, does adjuvant therapy actually help? And there's been a lot of work, and as you see, there's been 11 trials, 14,000 patients, $500 million have been spent on this, and we've had 2 positive trials. So there's the one, the S-track, which was barely positive statistically, and it was with a drug that's no longer being recommended for adjuvant therapy, so it's irrelevant at this point. And the most recent one, it was actually the Keynote 564, which is the second line on the right there, the green one. It had a progression-free survival primary endpoint, which it met in 2021, but the overall survival just came out in February, and it indeed is positive. And there was a lot of, not hugely positive, slightly positive, but it's important, a big breakthrough. And there was a lot of discussion in the community. I don't know if any of you were at ASCO GU, but I was. It was a huge, huge talk. People were, it's amazing, it's this stuff. And I just sat back and I thought, I don't know, from the patient perspective, is this amazing? And so take a look at the data. Next. So firstly, this was placebo versus pembrolizumab as an adjuvant, immunotherapy. And in the placebo arm, 58% of the patients did not recur in that period of time, meaning that, more than half of the patients were cured, essentially. They did not require any adjuvant therapy. And the of those, 42%, is that correct? I'm doing the math right? Correct, that did recur, what if they, was that so much better, really? I just don't, not sure. So next. We don't even know who's recurring. We have no biomarkers or anything. And also from the other arm, in the pembrolizumab intervention arm, these patients had about, I think 70% of them roughly, a lot of them had to go on steroids to control adverse events on that year of therapy. They had a lot of problems. No patients died, but typically with pembrolizumab, about 0.5% of patients will die on that treatment. And yet we know that 32%, so 1/3 of them essentially recurred even though they were on the pembrolizumab arm. So we just don't know who responds to therapy. And the question is from the patient perspective, this is not great data. We have harmed way more patients in this whole search for adjuvant therapy than we've helped them. So next. This brings me to guidelines. And I'd say guidelines is actually a best case. It's a good case of showing how patients have actually moved from the backseat passenger to being a co-navigator. And I'm very positive about patient participation in guideline development. So next. So sometimes it's really clear when you look at the benefits versus harms and you're generating guidelines, but it's not always. Sometimes it's a very delicate balance and the recommendation is weak. And in those cases, the patient perspective can be very interesting. Next. So those of you who are not familiar with how guidelines are generated, most use this methodology called the GRADE methodology. And the GRADE methodology is very well standardized, very well known. And one of the great things about GRADE is if you look, I don't have a pointer, but if you look in the middle there, right smack in the middle of that chart, you'll see patient values and preferences. And every single form for every single recommendation needs to have this GRADE form filled out. Thank you. And you can see that it needs to be filled in. And based on that information, that is what determines what the recommendation will be. And in fact, I've been on guidelines panel for 14 years, and I can tell you that the panel cannot even meet if the patient representative is not available, because there's no point. You cannot go through all of these forms if the patient is not there, the patient representative is not there to actually weigh in on this. What are the patient values and preferences? What is known? Is there data? It's a patient who's able to speak for many, not for their own story. So next. And sometimes you just don't know the answers to these questions and there is no data. So you have to go back to the patients and you run a survey. In this case, we had over 2,000 patients, I think 2,200 patients. And we asked them, what about biopsies? Because, the urologist wanted to know, should we be taking biopsies before we do a surgery? And we know that some of these surgeries would be unnecessary because some of those tumors that are seen on imaging are benign. And so therefore there was a question of it, well, what do the patients actually think about this? And well, the big kind of answer is about 15% of the patients said they would refuse a biopsy in the future, but the vast majority said they would consider it. And even more so if you talk about it, it's only a 3% rate of absolute refusal, but the most of them would be considerate. And I think that that's a really interesting concept. So we're able to go back to the guidelines committee with data generated by our patients, patient generated data, and say, add this. Well, this is what the patient perspective is. Just the vast majority would be open to that discussion, and it should be offered and discussed as to what the risks and benefits are for that patient. Next. So this is an important question. I think this is the most practical question of all. Is where can you find your patient group? Well, there's a really great resource. It's an amazing European-funded group here called WeCan. Yes, it's totally stolen from Obama. It's the Working Group for European Cancer Patient Advocate Groups. These are all umbrella groups in Europe that have at least, I think you have to have 4 different European countries represented. And they're all quite large, and collectively, I can't remember, but it's something like 14 million patients that are involved in this group of things. So I think most cancers are covered here, and there are some, maybe some things. So was running the IKCC for 14 years, and there's also the hereditary cancers, which is where the VHL falls under. And Urotis is also involved in there. So pretty much everything here would be for the gynecological cancers. We have an ovarian cancer group that's associated with us as well. So there's lots of different resources here. There is put an email here of Sarah Dadricks. She is the person who is paid to run the office, and she knows everything and everyone. So do reach out to her. I told her that I would share her email. She was fine with that. If you do have questions, ask her who would be the best person to reach out to, and she can help connect you to the patient advocate either in your country or in your region, but at least a European representative. That's easy to do. So next. I think I just have the conclusions. This is the last slide. So I think we can conclude that patient input to studies really improves the design of the study, the recruitment, and the compliance. It really has a huge impact. We know that there's a fairly large body of evidence of randomized controlled trials showing that patient engagement improves all sorts of software outcomes. But some randomized controlled trials also measure overall survival and progression-free survival and other hard outcomes. And even biomarkers are coming up now as one of the endpoints that are being measured in these. And it's really interesting to show that there's a fair amount of evidence out there. It's building and building that there's a benefit for engaging your patients and involving them in research. So rigorous methodology is lacking in some studies, but some data are really strong, and it does generally favor the survival benefit for engaged patients. But additional research with regard to real-world data is still really necessary, and I think that's what your challenge is. My question is to you is how? So that's really the end of my talk. I'd just like to thank you for your attention. If you could do the next slide. And here's my email address. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or anything you want some follow-up on anything. This is the beautiful city of Amsterdam, and navigating your way through this system will be a little bit like finding your bike at the Amsterdam Central Station. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was going to be my first question, actually, which is your bike. But I won't.
I can't tell you how many times I've spent an hour looking for my bike. So a lot of people do things like you see people put bags on the seats, or tie a ribbon on it or something to make it a little bit more easy to find.
So we've got a few minutes for questions. I'll just, and really hopefully do think up a question if you've got one. I'm just going to start to get things going with an observation and a question. And I think one of the wonderful things that you've brought out here is that sense of symbiotic benefit, that obviously this research and patient involvement benefits patients, but it actually can also benefit the research. It could make the research stronger.
It really does.
And when we were running, I talked a little bit at the beginning today, I referenced the precursor program to this, IDEAL4OMOP. And when we were at exactly the same stage, when we were starting to talk about team formation, we went through the same exercise, and we strongly encourage people to consider if and how, or how rather than if really, they could involve patients in their groups. And a number of tumour groups did that, and their research and their proposals were demonstrably stronger for it. So I think we've also seen, even though it wasn't research on patient-reported outcomes at that stage, it was very much around just getting some really good, clear goals for natural history studies, a little bit of work around comparative effectiveness, but getting that patient perspective was vital. The question I have for you was, Rachel, when we talked this morning, you spoke about some of the more tactical benefits that having that patient voice involved, being able to help with the publication of studies, write covering letters and so forth.
Good point.
There seem to be some very tactical and practical ways in which patient involvement can help your research program. Could you maybe say a few words about that?
Absolutely. I mean, there are things that people haven't even thought of, but it's really become normal for tenure committees to include patient representatives on the tenure considerations. And I think I probably am involved in 3 or 4 a year at this point. It's quite common. And so it's something to consider, is bringing in patients to recommend letters of recommendation. That will make people's heads turn. The other thing that patient representatives are good at that people don't think about is I write a lot of cover letters for submissions to journals. So what is the value? So this trial shows X, Y, and Z, but what's really important is this is why it's important for patients. And our patients report these problems. And this trial was fantastic at highlighting and supporting and perhaps even, tracking some progress towards the solution for those problems. So things like that are something we do, or we, grant applications, bringing in your patient organizations as a member on your grant organization is a sign of academic maturity. I mean, that's what it comes down to is if you know that you'll be reporting back to the patient organization and as part of your project, that's a really strong symptom. I mean, that will look favorable on most grant applications. And so it's actually required in most European grants these days to have some kind of a patient representative if you're in the healthcare field. But you'd be surprised. A lot of people, basic researchers, just simply don't know where to start and how to find and how to approach their patient organizations. And it can be challenging because there's a big gap between knowledge, and it can be it is formidable. I understand that. I've done it. But you grow from it. And that's something that, like I said, it's a sign of maturity, of showing that you're able to think outside of the box. And you're also able to understand the impact and the end stakeholders understand their participation and their understanding of their needs. So I would suggest that. So those are some of the things we do a lot are, ask your patient representatives to be involved in your research, offer to give talks to your local patient organizations because you are good at talking. They need speakers. So those are things that are, it's a marriage made in heaven, I swear. So it's a really important thing to do, and maybe even, you know, get some PhD students or whatever to help write summaries of their research or their theses, their PhD thesis. People are thrilled for content, even if it's really, you know, extremely hard to understand. It's a good exercise. And what we often do is then we encourage people then to put these summaries on the website, on their lab website or on their hospital website or something, because that's patient-facing content that the hospitals are also very happy. You can use that content in all sorts of ways. It's good for social media. It's good for all sorts of things. It's very useful information. Or make short videos, also possible.
Thank you, Rachel. Any questions from anyone? Okay, well, you've got Rachel's email address, which she very kindly provided. But just in the last couple of minutes, just, I guess, some final reflections from me. My eyes were first really opened to the importance, the practical importance of patient involvement. Really was that BASH study and that that Kaplan-Meier curve that you shared at the beginning, which showed exactly as you said, Rachel, if this was a drug, then, you know, a lot of people would be made very, very rich indeed. But yet this is something that's open to all of us. I think we've got a real opportunity here in IDEAL for OMOP to figure out that key question that Rachel had at the end is, you know, I think we're probably quite clear on how patients can be involved in RCT design.
Yeah.
But actually, I think it's more of a discovery process about what are we doing for OMOP studies, for database studies, for real world research. And I think we've got a great opportunity to figure that out here. And as you said, Rachel, this is something that's going to be, is important and will be increasingly important in funding applications. And of course, we have a very kind of real example of that here with the folks on the call today and on the wider program, because they will be coalescing teams. They will be applying for the €300,000 study fund. And there will be a group of experts, including you, Rachel, who will be looking to adjudicate that. So it really, I don't think there could be any stronger motivation for folks to be thinking about, well, actually, what is that? You know, how can we take these ideas forward? How can we involve patients and look to make that improve and strengthen our research? So we're up to the hour. Rachel, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for giving your time.
Thank
you so much. Both for delivering the preparation. Yes, Aristotle, please come on in.
I would like to ask Rachel. I always thought that patient engagement would be good, but sometimes patients do not want to engage. I don't know if you have come across this situation.
Absolutely. Well, especially in cancer, where most people want to move on with their life.
Yes. So I always thought that it would be better for the patient to know exactly what is going on, but some patients simply don't want to know anything about this. I don't know why this happens.
I agree with you, and I think that there are certain limitations, like I mentioned before, psychological limitations, where people really aren't focusing on moving on beyond their cancer and want to put close that chapter of their life. However, what we also find is, for example, prostate cancer groups, the vast majority of the patient advocates are women. And that's because their father had it, their husband had it, or, you know, or are living with it, their brother is living with it, and so forth. So sometimes it's not the person affected that is the best advocate. Sometimes it's the person who's lived through it with their loved one. And that's also an important source. And it really is, you're absolutely right. It's not for everyone. Not everyone can be a good patient advocate. I think the biggest problem we have had experienced personally is a lot of people are so overwhelmed by it. It's an emotional aspect, and you have to find those individuals who are able to place it in a context that's bigger than their own story. Their own story is the key rock of their experience, but you really need the patient advocates to be able to speak for others too. And that requires that evidence-based advocacy of finding out what is the big picture, how are the majority of patients feeling, And it's incredibly tough. But if you're working at the European level, you do need to think above and beyond a single individual story.
And Rachel, just to pick up
Thank
on
you.
that, and apologies, I dropped off for some reason. But if we, given the relationship, the contact that you've given at we have access to organisations that have already found the patients and potentially
Correct.
have the patients with those.
And WeCan also trains
concepts.
patients. They
Yeah.
have the WeCan Academy. They train patient advocates. It's an incredibly effective platform. It's free for patients to participate. And it's absolutely brilliant the way they've done this.
Thank you.
I'm a big fan of WeCan.
So this platform is WeCan.
Yes. WeCan is the European platform, and they have all flavors of cancer representatives there. They're all trained, and they speak at Parliament. They know, they have huge at the European Parliament. They have huge connections within all the industry business as well. They're incredibly well connected and highly professional group.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Any last questions for Rachel before we finally wrap up? In which case, just to reiterate our thanks to you, Rachel, for an excellent and thought-provoking presentation today. Everyone else, look out for the ongoing communications around the programme, around SharePoint, and we will next see you in just over a fortnight's time, when we will be talking about the important concepts of data privacy, GDPR, and how to make sure that the studies that you're going to start designing are compliant with that relevant legislation. But until then, wishing you the very best. Have a great day. Have a great week. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye.